Wonderful. Thank you so much. So who has pictures they would like to make look better? Who is perfectly happy with every picture they've ever taken and doesn't need a develop module in Lightroom? Anybody? Nobody's going to even fake it? Yeah, just one. So we're going to talk about Lightroom's develop module, and essentially, it's an interesting thing. I've spent a lot of time talking to photographers, teaching photographers, and I show them how all the buttons and knobs work, and how what every slider does, and which direction to slide it, and then they say, okay, but for this picture, now what do I do? Like, I know how all these controls work, but I don't know what to do. So today I'm going to try and help you better understand exactly how you want to approach your images. Yes, of course, I'm going to talk about what the adjustments do and how they affect your images, etc. But more importantly, is sort of thinking about what are we trying to accomplish? What's the end game as far as our photos? Now, sometimes there's you almost think like a generic goal. We always want certain things to happen in our images, but not always. So we'll talk about some exceptions as well. So let's start off with the basic adjustments. When it comes to the basic adjustments, these are the adjustments that, as far as I'm concerned, they're the only mandatory adjustments. And when somebody asks if I've worked on an image, that's a really good image. What camera did you use? That's a really good image. Did you work on it in Photoshop? Right? When people ask if I work on the image in the computer, my answer is always yes, of course. The camera can only do so much. I need to interpret what the camera captured. So from my perspective, in terms of applying adjustments in the computer, it's always necessary. And now it's just a matter of to what extent are you going to manipulate that photo, optimize that photo, alter that photo, interpret that photo to realize whatever it was that you had in mind when you captured the image. And it's interesting, a lot of times people say, well, what's the story you're trying to tell with a photo? I don't know. I just saw something that I like and I pushed the button, right? And so I wasn't thinking about, well, actually I was thinking about a lot with this photo. Is it in focus? Am I going to get the exposure right? When is the bird going to fly in exactly the right position so that I can, produce the image that I really want? There's a lot going on, and so sometimes things are going to be a little bit less than perfect in terms of the result. So here we've got an image that, your first reaction is probably that's absolutely perfect. You're probably thinking things like, I love how Tim waited until the eagle tilted its wings just so, and how Tim waited to push the button until like one of those talons was pulled forward just a little bit. That gesture is really nice. And I love how Tim waited until the bird happened to be in front of the water instead of the trees, because that's an interesting bit of reflections. And it was perfectly exposed, except maybe just a little bit dark. But probably that's just the display, not Tim. So how are we going to optimize the photo? Well, the first thing is figure out, what does the overall tonality look like? What does the color look like? But here's the thing. If you thought that this image looked like it wasn't exposed properly, I would imagine that your first thought had to have been, there's something wrong with the display because there's no way Tim would have captured an image that was less than perfect and still shown it to us. Which brings us to a very important point. I mentioned that X-Rite was kind enough to sponsor today's presentation. How many of you have not yet calibrated your monitor display with a fancy gadget such as this? Oh my goodness, we must. So one of the things, it's sort of an interesting challenge because today our displays come out of the box pretty accurate in terms of color. So if you don't calibrate your display in terms of the color, you might not necessarily notice it. It's probably off a little bit, but not by such that you would notice it just with the naked eye. However, most displays, when they come out of the box, are about twice as bright as they should be. A full stop too bright. Now, if your photos were all a full stop too bright, how would you feel about that? Not so good. And the problem is when your display is a full stop too bright, you're adjusting all of your images to be about a full stop too dark, kind of like this image. A full stop too dark, and then you make a print on a wonderful printer, and what's your reaction? The print's too dark. And who do you blame? Anybody but yourself, right? It must be the printer, the inks, the camera, something. Maybe it's my USB cable. But by calibrating your display, you're not only adjusting the color. I know a lot of photographers think about calibration as creating accurate color. You're also able to optimize the overall tonality of your display as well, which means, in this case, in many cases, darkening down that display by about a full stop. Why is it so important? Because you're making adjustments to your images based on what you see on your display. If the display's not accurate, your adjustments don't reflect what you're really trying to accomplish. So you're brightening up or darkening down the image or shifting the color, whatever it is that you're doing, based on an inaccurate view of your photo. So really critical to calibrate. You don't have to calibrate every day. Back in the old days with CRT monitors, I would tell you about every 2 weeks or so you ought to recalibrate, because they really do shift, especially when the display gets to be about 2 years old or so. With LCD displays, not a big deal. The biggest issue really, frankly, is that over time the light will dim a little bit, so it's going to start to get darker and darker, but that takes a while. And so calibrating every 6 months even, perfectly adequate. But it is highly, highly recommended. But then we get to actually work on the photo itself. So let's take a look at this photo. We know that it's probably a little too dark. I could look at the histogram here and say, oh wow, okay, that was shifted. At least I didn't clip any shadow detail, but it definitely needed to have been a little bit brighter, the overall exposure. When that's the case, when I look at the photo and say it's definitely too dark or too bright, then I'll touch the exposure adjustment. Otherwise, if it looks like a pretty good exposure, I don't mess with exposure. See how that works? Exposure is good, don't mess with exposure. Easy breezy. In this case though, I would say the exposure is a little bit too dark. Not just because the shadow detail seems to be a little bit hidden, but because the overall image looks a little bit dark. And so in that type of situation, I will brighten the exposure. Little secret, don't tell anybody. I almost never bother with the clipping preview on the exposure slider because I'm going to worry about clipping later in just a few seconds. So I'll just make an exposure adjustment based on a visual evaluation of the photo, which again I know is pretty accurate because I used something like the Color Monkey display in order to calibrate and profile my display. So that looks to be pretty good, but I want perfection here. Now more often than not, I want the brightest pixel in my image to be absolutely white and the darkest pixel to be absolutely black, or very close to that. Why? I have no idea, but Ansel said that's the way it needs to be, and he seemed to know what he was talking about. So usually I want to maximize that tonal range. I want good contrast. I want a full range of tonal values in the image. And I want to do it sort of scientifically. I want to know that mathematically I did a good job on my photo. So instead of just adjusting the white point, for example, I want a clipping preview. I want to be able to see where I'm losing detail in the photo and to what extent. So here, for example, that bald eagle, his white feathers, boy, they sure are white. So white that there is absolutely no detail in them whatsoever, which obviously is not such a good thing. So in many, many cases, I won't say without exception, I might say almost without exception, but in a fairly consistent way, I'm going to always brighten up until I'm almost clipping, but not quite.
What are you hitting?
It's a secret key that, you have to pay extra for the secret key. So on the keyboard, I'm holding the Alt key on Windows, Option key on Macintosh, which gives me this clipping preview so I can see which channels are losing detail. So you see the red channel. You can probably see a little bit of yellow, which of course would reflect the blue channel. And when we get to white, that means that we have lost detail in all three color channels, red, green, and blue, and therefore that area truly is white. So again, what I'm wanting generally is to push right up against the limit. I want to get right up against white or nearly white. Usually I don't want to clip any channels, meaning I won't push the reds until I start seeing white. So I'm losing, if you take a close look here, initially the reds are what are clipping first. Is that okay? Could I push further? Maybe, depends on the image. The classic example when it comes to reds would be a red rose. If we blow out all the detail on the red channel, we've basically blown out all the detail because red comprises all of the detail in that photo. Not literally, but in a manner of speaking. So usually I don't want to clip much of anything, so I'll go right up to the point. So hold the Alt or Option key, increase the value for whites until I start to see pixels appear, and then back off until they've just disappeared or there's just a couple of them left. Now, most importantly is we've followed mathematics here. You can't argue with math. And so when someone says, well, it looks like you've blown out the highlight detail, I can say, you are wrong. mathematically, I can prove to you that no highlight detail has been lost. More on that in a moment, though. Because when you're trying to sell a print, it's not really about proving it mathematically, it's about mathematically getting money from them. So it's a little more important to make the customer happy. But to the blacks first, before we talk about that highlight detail, same basic concept. Hold the Alt or Option key. And in this case, moving generally toward the left until I see pixels appearing. In other words, I'm darkening the blacks until I'm starting to lose detail in those deep dark shadow areas. Sometimes I might start with a little bit of lost detail, hypothetically speaking. Of course, I would never capture an exposure that was less than perfect in that way. Thank you for pretending to believe that. So I'm going to go to the left until I start to see some of those black pixels appearing, and usually to the point where I've got a little bit of that black clipping, maybe just a tiny little bit, because again, I do want to spread out my tonal range, get nice dark blacks and nice bright whites, but it will depend upon the image, and we'll talk more about that in a moment as well. So in this case, you might notice I actually brightened up my black point just a little bit in order to prevent some of that clipping, so I can recover, you might say, some of that detail in the deep dark shadows. So now I've maximized that tonal range. If we take a look at the histogram, there's going to be you can probably barely even see it up at the far right, just a little bit of a spike at the end there, some of the reds that got just slightly clipped. And at the left end, the blacks, we also see it's stretching out to the end. It was pretty much there to begin with. So we've essentially stretched out that histogram. We've spread out the tonal range. We've increased a little bit of contrast in the process. I've set my white point and my black point. So now, once again, coming back to that person I'm trying to sell a print to, I can mathematically prove to them that they're wrong and there really is detail in the highlights and the shadows because I didn't clip. But in order to get their money from them to sell that print, I need to make it look like I didn't lose that detail. And at the moment, I would say at least the white detail in the shadows, in the feathers on the head, the detail's there, but it doesn't exactly look like it. Whereas if we pull down the highlight value, we can actually emphasize that detail. So now I don't have to try to show them the mathematical equations. They just see feather detail and they like it and they buy the print. Well, actually, I'm not just darkening those highlights. It's more. I'm doing two things here. I'm darkening the brighter values, but I'm also enhancing contrast in those bright values. If you're familiar with the clarity adjustment, we're essentially applying clarity just to the highlights as we're darkening those highlights. So we're not making them muddy by darkening them, we're actually enhancing some contrast there as well. So now things are starting to look better. I probably don't need quite that much of an adjustment, but right about in there. If I were to brighten the highlights, then I need to pay careful attention because I'm possibly going to clip the whites if I push those highlights too far. So I'd want to revisit the whites if I had applied an adjustment to the highlights. But let's take a look at the shadows. Now usually, once I've set my white point and my black point, then I want to darken the highlights just a little bit. Usually. Are there exceptions? Of course, there are always exceptions. What do I want to do with the shadows? It depends. Sometimes I want to brighten the shadows, sometimes I want to darken the shadows. I would say that for me personally, more often than not, I'm darkening the shadows. But that's me. Usually I like a little more contrast, a little more drama, a little more impact in the photo. Usually, but not always. Other photographers usually want to open up the shadow detail. They kind of want the fill flash type of effect. They want to bring out more of the texture and whatnot. In an image like this, I probably would want to bring out a little bit more of that shadow detail so we can see more of the feathers on the wings of the eagle, for example. But I could also darken down those shadows if I wanted to. And the same basic concept applies as with those highlights. If we're brightening up the shadows, there's a risk of the image starting to look a little bit muddy. But again, that clarity is being applied at the same time so that we're brightening up the shadows and enhancing contrast a little bit. The result is usually quite nice. Obviously, there's the possibility of pushing things a little too far, where we start to wash things out, we don't have as much contrast, but we can choose now. Not only have we extended our dynamic range, have we increased overall contrast in the image, but then we can lighten and darken the highlights and the shadows based on our own desires in terms of interpreting the photo. Do I want you to see more detail? Do I want it to be more dramatic, more contrast, etc.? As a result, I've effectively applied a contrast adjustment without even touching the contrast slider. I might have darkened down the shadows, that's enhancing contrast. I've set my white and black points, that certainly has affected contrast. That clarity adjustment, when I'm reducing the value for highlights, that's a little bit of contrast in a localized way. Because of all this, I find that I rarely, if ever, need to touch the contrast slider. I could certainly increase contrast or decrease contrast, but I find that I rarely need the contrast adjustment because I've accomplished my goal in terms of contrast with these other sliders, the whites, the blacks, the highlights, and the shadows. So again, using that clipping preview to set my black and white points, and then highlights and shadows to fine-tune mid-tone contrast based on how much detail I want to present or drama I want in the photo. Now that's all well and good, but it sort of feels like a almost robotic approach, right, to adjusting the image. But it's a robotic approach that works absolutely every single time without exception. Just testing. Of course there are exceptions. Of course there are exceptions. So here we go. We hold the Alt or Option key, and we bring the white point up until, oops, right there. Let me back off just a little. Right there. Perfect. Set our black point. Oh, look, we're at minus 100 on blacks, and we still haven't gotten a true black. I need to push it further. Somebody please call Adobe and tell them we need the scale to go to minus 200. And then we need to reduce the value for highlights and maybe, open up some shadow detail. That's lovely. That's exactly what a foggy day in Seattle looks like, with almost pitch black windows on the Space Needle and just way too much detail. What do you say? There's before. That's what the camera did, and that's what I did. Which one do you like better? You can be honest. The camera was smarter, right? Therefore proving that I was lying when I said that we can use this mathematical approach every single time. Yes, there are exceptions. There are situations where I don't want a pure white and a pure black in my image, and it's up to you to figure out which those situations are. Usually, it's pretty easy. It's usually pretty simple. We'll just bring these back. In fact, let's just reset the tone altogether. With the whites, we go up to there. Is that a problem yet? No, it seems fine. Maybe it's a little bright, but it overall seems fine. Take the blacks all the way down, and usually, how do you know when it was wrong? You go, oh. Okay, let's revisit. Then what do we do with our clipping preview? We just ignore it. Forget clipping preview. It really is all about the image. So then we come back and say, okay, maybe we just need to leave that where it was. And the whites, it's up to you how bright you want the brights to be, etc. But the point is that we don't always want to stretch out that tonal range, but more often than not, I would say, with the typical type of photographic scenario, we do. So once we've gotten that overall tonality squared away, then we can start to think about the color. Now, the color is an interesting thing because the camera is actually trying to get you accurate color. The problem is that the way the camera operates, it's more or less trying to remove the color of the light. If that's what we wanted, we could just sleep in until noon and go take our pictures, right? And be done by 2 p.m. But we want some of that color, so now it's up to us to try and figure out what did it really look like? What should it look like? And there's several options available to us. Now, if you're shooting raw, it doesn't matter what you've got in the camera in terms of color because you can fine-tune it later. It does not matter what your white balance is set to in the camera. I almost always leave mine set to auto white balance. Let the camera do what it's going to do. Whatever, I'll fix it later. That's me being lazy with the camera. Usually it works out pretty well. Sometimes then I have a lot more work to do after the fact. But the reality is, because I'm a control freak, I'm going to tinker with the color afterwards anyway. And so for me, there's not a huge advantage to trying to get it perfect in the camera. But that depends on what you're doing. I'm usually shooting outdoors with, single light source, the sun. And so usually it's not such a big issue. If you're shooting indoors, if you've got mixed lighting, then that light can really become a challenge. And so as I mentioned before, getting color accurate in the camera can certainly be helpful, especially in terms of your workflow, and then having consistent color. So using a white balance preset in your camera. I talked about using a custom white balance before we got started today, using something like the Color Checker Passport so that we get really accurate color right from the original capture. And so those methods work really well, but you might still want to fine-tune things, especially in terms of that creative interpretation. Now, I could certainly use a preset. Just as I can set a preset in the camera, I can choose a white balance preset. So maybe it was fluorescent lighting that night, or maybe it was, daylight, or maybe it was, I don't know, let's call it tungsten. There we go. It was a moonlit night in Seattle. So we can choose a preset just as we could in the camera, and we get the same effect. No penalty in terms of image quality. As far, obviously here quality is relative because now I've made it look like a moonlit night when it wasn't, but we can affect the color without actually altering overall image quality. We can also use the eyedropper, so I can come into the image. So you remember we were talking about using like a gray card when we're capturing an image, so I can say, well, I think that the sky was a perfectly neutral gray. Well, actually the sky was blue. The opposite of blue is yellow, so the image gets shifted toward yellow. So if I can find something in the image that actually should have been perfectly neutral, an actual gray value in the photo itself, I can click on it and apply that adjustment. Here's the thing, I mentioned I'm a control freak. I'm always gonna go mess with the sliders, the temperature and tint sliders. So from my perspective, I might as well just start there. If I'm gonna mess with them anyway, I'll just go straight to it. And I do recommend, if you don't feel comfortable in terms of evaluating the color, swing these sliders through the extremes. Who would believe that this was accurate color? Boy, what an amazing sunset that was in Seattle. Not a cloud in the sky, no rain that day, and an amazing sunset, the trifecta for Seattle. And who's gonna believe this was really a moonlit night? No. So we know that those extremes aren't quite right, and then as we come into the middle here, we can say, okay, it was somewhere around there-ish. And then with the tint, so the temperature is our blue-yellow shift. Usually that's going to be a little bit of a bigger swing one way or the other in terms of our possible interpretation when we're trying to get it accurate. And by accurate, I mean the way I remember it looking or the way I wanted it to look. With tint, we're shifting between magenta and green. That's usually going to be a more significant effect in terms of the color. We're usually going to want a smaller shift one way or the other. It looks a little pinkish off in the distance. Let me see if I can shift that toward green to make it look better without making it look too green. So just kind of fine tuning back and forth. So using those extremes of swinging it way over and then way back, that'll help you figure out where you want to settle in. And then another really helpful tip here, if you're having a hard time getting the mouse exactly where you need it, you can't quite figure out what the right spot is, just click on the numeric value associated with that slider, and then I can use the up arrow to increase the value, up arrow on the keyboard, to increase the value, and this works for all of these numeric values within Lightroom. Just click on the field, up arrow to increase, down arrow to decrease, add the shift key for bigger adjustments, usually a 10-fold change. So instead of shifting by 1, 2, 3, it's 10, 20, 30. It'll vary depending on the specific adjustment, but generally a 10-fold factor. So shift up arrow for big shifts toward magenta, shift down arrow for big shifts away from magenta toward green. And then once I start to get where I think I'm pretty close, somewhere right in here, give or take, then I'll let go of the shift key and just use the up and down arrows to fine tune and try and get that color exactly where I want it. And speaking of color, then we have our vibrance and saturation adjustments, which I love. What photo doesn't need more saturation? There are no exceptions. Oh wait, there are exceptions. Sometimes we want gray values in our photo. Sometimes we want nothing but gray values in our photo. But when there is color, when color was part of our motivation for taking the picture, wow, what a pretty yellow airplane. Snap. We probably want to enhance the color. Color is part of the story, part of the reason I took the picture, so I probably want to enhance the color. Vibrance is the best way to do that, because vibrance has built-in self-control. That's very helpful, so we don't accidentally push things just a little bit too far. So vibrance has self-control in two ways. Number one, vibrance automatically protects skin tones. So if you photograph people, it helps to make sure that you're not taking my skin tones and making them look like I got a sunburn. So it protects those skin tones. It also has a variable effect on color. In essence, you can think of vibrance as applying a stronger adjustment to the colors that need it, meaning a stronger adjustment to the colors that are not very saturated without increasing very much the colors that already were saturated. So we're bringing up the colors that need it and sort of, not completely, but sort of leaving alone the colors that were already saturated. So increasing everything, but a stronger effect on the colors that need it. The result is that, for example, if you watch the sky here, as I increase and decrease, the sky is getting a pretty strong effect, and the greenery in the background, the wheat fields, also getting a fairly strong effect. But the airplane, the yellows in the airplane, not being affected very much at all. There's a stronger effect in the sky that's not terribly saturated, and a lesser effect on the yellows of the plane, which were already pretty saturated. And so I can push that vibrance pretty far before things start to look weird. I would say here, for example, it's not bad, it's just a little too good, right? It's not horrible, it's not cartoonish and ridiculous, but there certainly is a little too much saturation. I push it a little bit, but it's not absurd the way we can, get a ridiculous effect in many cases. So here it starts to get a little more cartoonish with that saturation adjustment, which is operating in a more linear way. Now, what if you get to this point and you're thinking, I should reduce that value? That was too much, Tim. Self-control, remember? Yeah, but I don't want to bring it down too much because then the blues start to get a little bit too muted relative to the airplane. Well, then what I'll do is use vibrance to even out the color saturation. So now everything has more saturation in a good way. It's just too much. So I want to just take everything down a little bit. So I'll increase the value for vibrance and then reduce saturation. So I've equalized, you might say, this overall saturation of colors in the photo. The blues have been brought up closer to the yellows, and I think that's overall a good thing. But now everything's a little bit too saturated, so I want to bring everything down just a little bit. So a relatively strong boost. Here, obviously, I've exaggerated things a bit, but a relatively strong boost of vibrance, and then tone down with saturation just a little bit, for situations especially where color was part of the reason you took the picture in the first place, or part of the reason you wanted to photograph that particular subject. And that variable effect does, by the way, occur when we use a negative value as well. You can sort of think of vibrance as putting on the brakes before any colors get too oversaturated or undersaturated. That adjustment sort of starts to slow down as we get to the extremes, is another way of thinking about vibrance. So it's variable in both directions, but generally speaking, I would say I usually want an increased value for vibrance with most photos. We have, of course, the clarity adjustment as well. I used to call this the haze buster. I don't anymore because there's something even better, which we'll take a look at in a moment. But rather, it's a detail enhancer. It's mid-tone contrast enhancement. So just as we can open up the shadows, but add a little bit of contrast at the same time, we can do the same thing to the overall image with clarity. So we can take those details. Whenever there's detail, texture that I think is really important, why would you travel all the way to South Korea just to photograph cabbage? That was a question somebody asked me when I posted another photo of cabbage. But here it was arranged in a triangle. If you look me up on 500px or Instagram, you can see the pyramid of cabbage that I traveled to South Korea to photograph. So why would I travel? Well, I just happened to be in South Korea and they happen to have cabbage on display at the markets. So why did I take this picture? It's not because I was trying to get all my veggies for the day. It's because the texture just grabbed. I mean, all of those little nooks and crannies, I was fascinated by it. And it was this sort of soft light, but there were shadows back behind because the cabbage was all displayed out. There was an awning overhead, and so the front of the cabbage is getting a little bit of that overcast light on it, but then it fades off really quickly because of the shop being covered by an awning. I was just fascinated by it. Well, the whole reason, really, it was not about cabbage, it was not about green, it was not about vegetables, it was about that texture. I just loved the texture. Whenever texture is part of the reason that I was drawn to a subject, there's a good chance that I'm going to want to increase the value for clarity. It can add a little bit of drama without taking the contrast too far. It enhances those textures, those details. It's sort of like sharpening. So think sharpening, but on a larger scale. So contrast enhancement can really add some drama to the photo. I could even, this isn't the right photo for it, I could use a negative value for clarity if I want to soften up the image to get more of a painterly kind of a look. So it doesn't work so great for cabbage, but it's a good option for portraits, for example. Not too much. We still want to have some degree of texture on our skin, right? But we can soften things up, get a more kind of dreamlike, ethereal quality in the photo by using a negative value for clarity. But for the types of photography that I do, typically I want to increase clarity at least a little bit. Other times, clarity just won't quite cut it. If I take the clarity all the way up to its maximum value, we certainly see an effect, don't we? And nobody's going to believe that it was a clear day with no haze in the sky. So we need something stronger. Now, I wish that it was sitting right here below clarity, because to me it's the same basic concept, just more aggressive. But they decided, Adobe decided, that our dehaze slider should be way, way, way down here in effects. Right? That's what we call stunned silence. Except with a few oh wows I heard. Is that amazing? So we can reduce haze, or if you decide, you know, I sure wish it had been a little bit more hazy and almost foggy, we could take that down to a negative value and add some haze. But generally speaking, I would say if there's haze in the photo, now there is a risk of taking things a little too far, as always. If only dehaze had that built-in self-control. It starts to look a little bit too crisp, a little too contrasty. The colors, especially in the shadows, have a tendency to kind of come out a little too much. In this case, a little bit too blue. I know the shadows tend to be a little cool, but this is a little over the top. So I might shift to a little bit warmer color temperature, maybe somewhere in there, for example. But I would argue this is probably a bit too strong, wouldn't you say? Certainly a big improvement, sort of, or certainly a big change anyway, but maybe a little bit too aggressive. So I would probably back that off. And it's one of the challenges with saturation, for sure, but also when it comes to clarity and dehaze, is you sort of get desensitized a little bit. So you almost have to, okay, let me turn that off and on, before and after. Another handy keyboard shortcut when you're in the develop module, / on the keyboard, will switch you to the before view. Notice that it says up at the top right of the image before, just to help remind you. And then back to the after view and say, oh, okay, that's pretty strong. I was a little heavy-handed there. Let's bring that dehaze back a little bit, and maybe somewhere more around in there. You know, even this I would call a very strong adjustment. Am I trying to make it look like there was no haze? Maybe. Or am I just trying to tone it down just a little bit? And again, it really is a matter of how you want to interpret the photo. But sometimes, you know, you go up to Steptoe Butte in the Palouse and it's a hazy day. And you can't just come back tomorrow. Maybe you got to go home. So you take what you're given and you try to work with it. After the fact, wait for a good, strong, windy day, then the haze will just blow out of there. Actually, then there'll be dust instead of haze. All right? But still, a pretty effective adjustment. Can be pretty magical in a variety of situations. Next time you're up on top of the Empire State Building, good chance it's going to be ever so slightly hazy in New York City. Dehaze will take care of it, right? It'll make it look like clear, perfect day. No, but it will improve things significantly, and especially in terms of just being able to see the detail, the texture. You know, in the case of being up on the Empire State Building, you're going to see buildings pop out of the haze that you didn't even realize were there by just increasing that value a little bit. So thus far, we've been talking mostly about relatively straightforward adjustments, kind of our, you know, generic basic adjustments, obviously being careful to think about how we approach the image with each of those. But when it comes to color, then I start to take a little bit of a closer look and try to figure out, okay, what should the color really look like? So let's take a look at the hue, saturation, and luminance, the HSL controls. So over on the right panel, I'm in HSL. I could also go to color. Exact same thing. Exact same sliders arranged in a different order. When we choose the color option, it's hue, saturation, luminance on a per color basis. HSL, 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 HSL. When we're under HSL, it's all of the hues for each of the individual colors, and then all the saturations, then all of the luminances. So if we decide, for example, you know, those trees, they're looking a little too yellow. So let's shift the hues, and because I want them to be red-leafed trees. Just testing. Nobody's going to protest that? No, really, it was a Japanese maple. Honest. And the sky is looking way too blue. We should totally make it look, you know, like, there we go. No, this was infrared film that I was using in this kind of. We can do all sorts of crazy things to our photos by shifting the colors. Okay, maybe that's not what we actually want to do in this case. But what might we have actually wanted to do? Let's reset those. You know, maybe the yellows weren't quite yellow enough. If I shift just a little bit, let's take a look at that. There's before and after. Sort of purifying those colors. It actually was looking a little bit reddish. And these were definitely yellow leaves. And so shifting those hues. Think of it as like a color balance or a color temperature adjustment, on a per color basis. And this really starts to get interesting in terms of affecting individual colors in the photo in a variety of different ways. So for example, let's say we'll go ahead and let's crank up the saturation a little more. And we say, well, yeah, that's good, but those yellows are looking a little bit odd. They're just not quite looking yellow enough. So we can take those oranges over a little bit and those yellows. See the yellows up toward the top center, in particular, a little right of center? So we shift them toward a greenish look versus a kind of orangish look. And we can get those colors looking exactly the way we want them. And maybe even take the saturation of just the yellows. So there's desaturating the yellows versus boosting the yellows. And they were seeming to kind of fall behind a little bit, the yellows, whereas the blues were looking pretty good. Maybe they're a hair on the green side, so I might shift those just a little bit to make them a little more pure blue. And actually, I would say that the saturation of the blues maybe a little too much. They're standing out a little too much. It looks a little odd, like, okay, there's definitely some blue in there, and I'm ignoring all of the other colors. It's looking almost artificial, so I could actually desaturate just the blues. So there's, increasing it even worse than it was, but I can just tone it down. It doesn't need much. And very often with these hue, saturation, and luminance sliders, we don't need much of an adjustment. I often tell photographers, don't even touch the mouse. Just like think about touching the mouse, and it'll move by itself just a little tiny bit. Like that's how much you want to move it. Okay, touch the mouse, but don't move your hand. Just think about moving it, and that was enough, right? Just a tiny little bit, because if we desaturate the blues here, obviously that loses a big part of why we took the picture in the first place. If we increase it a lot, oh my goodness, it's electric blue. But if we tone it down just a little tiny bit, maybe right around in there, then I think it starts to look pretty good, where we've evened things out, even beyond what vibrance can do, because now we're getting to exercise that control over the image ourselves. We're getting, oh, the blues are a little too hot, or the yellows need to be shifted, or the whatever, and you can evaluate. I'm sure there's some colors in here, maybe even some of the magentas that I might want to boost the saturation of. So if you look in the shadows of the pink buildings, maybe I want to boost that just a little bit, but again, just a little bit. So starting to really scrutinize the individual colors in the photo and trying to make sure that everything's looking the way I want it to look. Actually, here the color looks pretty good, doesn't it? I guess I don't need to do a thing. You might argue, well, the yellows are a little too saturated, except that was yellow light. I'm trying to ask Rome to please change the light bulbs to something daylight balanced. So far, they haven't responded to my letters. So it looks pretty good, right? Not too bad. Let's turn off our HSL adjustments. Oh, it's looking pretty good because I already worked on it a lot. A lot. It can take a while to try to get the colors exactly the way you want them. So here, looking at the before, you thought the yellows were noticeable beforehand, but the real before is here. The yellows were really over the top. And if you look especially over toward the right of Castel San Angelo, and the wall down below, and then the curvature on the right-hand side, it's got this kind of like orangish, pinkish kind of a color to it. And the blues, if you look in the sky, there's more of a purpley kind of look over toward the left versus more of a true blue over toward the right. So if we turn on the HSL adjustments and have a look here, look at all this shimmying around I've done with this photo. Why did I do this beforehand? Because I would have never been able to reproduce all of this with the pressure of you guys staring at me while I'm doing it. But look at all those slider movements. So I'm shifting the hues, and you can see that, for example, the oranges, that was those areas up over here, shifted toward the right to make them a little bit more yellow. Some of the yellows as well pushed, well, no, the yellows weren't pushed, but the greens shifted over toward the left to make them a little more yellow as opposed to more of a cyan. And then saturations. So all the saturation sliders, the red taken down significantly because the red was in large part those orange. So in fact, I'll bring that back to where it was, and you can see some of the reddish values up over in here, or we can exaggerate them just a little bit. So taking those values down, the magentas likewise. So you can see some of those, most of those have been shifted in terms of the hue, so you're not going to see quite as much of an effect. But again, lots of little individual slider movements. Why? Because, let's go ahead and just reset this image. Because that's what it looked like when it was first put together. Theoretically. Not really. Because this is actually an HDR image. So this isn't even what the camera saw. The camera saw 3 individual exposures that I blended into an HDR image, and this was just, this you can call just the default interpretation of that HDR, which there's sort of no such thing, right? HDR is this weird concept in terms of more bit depth than we can ever possibly hope for in a normal photograph, more dynamic range, etc. And so we're getting, you know, this interpretation of the photo, the color, there's detail in there, but obviously we would need to have some significant adjustments. And when it comes to an HDR, typically those adjustments really truly are very, very significant in terms of the effect. I'll just set this to auto and see how it does. That's reasonable. So a lot of work would go into creating that HDR interpretation, and we saw a lot of work just insofar as the individual colors. Why was the color such a challenge in this case? Is it because of HDR? Partly, because now we're opening up lots of shadow detail. We're capturing individual exposures for the highlights versus the shadows, for example. But also, part of the reason that the color was a challenge is because of Rome. Because they had to use all sorts of different light sources. There's still, it's dark, but there's still some light in the sky. You can't tell quite as much now that we've got this darkened version of the photo. But if we back this up to there, you can see there was some light in the sky still, casting a little bit of color. There are lots and lots and lots of incandescent bulbs, and over toward the right there's some that were some sort of halogen or whatnot. There's all sorts of different light sources creating all sorts of different colors, and that's making my job a little bit more difficult. When it's natural light, now it's more about aesthetic taste and what am I going to do with the individual colors in terms of the paint on the houses here. That's just an interpretation for me. But when we're dealing with mixed light, especially artificial light, then it becomes a bit more of a challenge. All right. What about color? Well, sometimes color has nothing to do with the reason you took the picture in the first place. There's color here. You can see a little bit of a yellowish cast, a little bit of warm light. But really, this was all about texture, light and shadow. Stairs obviously forming that linear pattern, and then the wonderful shadows of the buildings to the left that are creating this zigzag of darkness there. But the reality is that the color is not needed, and so I'll just choose the black and white option under treatment, or remember the HSL and color options. I can also just choose the B and W for black and white. Right there, same thing. They're basically 2 links to the same button, you might say. And then I can go into the individual color sliders. So just as we saw, we can increase or decrease saturation for individual colors. We can shift the color balance, as it were, the hue for individual colors. Well, here, when we've gone to black and white mode, I can lighten or darken the purples. See how all the purples now from the original image? Oh wait, there weren't any purples. See how the magentas, oh wait. See how the blue, oh wait, hold on a second. See how the, wait. Oh wait, we found one. The yellows, because if you recall, the image was pretty monochromatic in the first place. There was some color there, but barely. And so in this case, just switching to black and white, these individual color sliders don't really do anything for me. We'll see what they do in just a moment. But that underscores the importance of tonal adjustments with black and white. It theoretically should go without saying, right? If we have nothing but tone left, we sure need to pay attention to our tonal adjustments. But what I see a lot of photographers do is they go to their basic set of adjustments, they fine-tune those to perfection, then they convert the image to black and white, and they never go back to the basics. But when we're dealing with a single channel, a luminance channel, as opposed to red, green, and blue channels, the adjustment that we would want may be different, might be significantly different. And so, in fact, let's take a look at the histogram, see what that looks like. Oh, it looks like we've still got some room for the whites. So if I go to my white point, hold the Alt or Option key, let's push this further and further. Oh my goodness, look at that. Like 15 points or so of adjustment that potentially would be different. That doesn't mean it's necessarily the right adjustment, but what I probably did before versus would do now is very likely to be different. This might be maybe a little bit strong, or not. Maybe I'll just tone down the shadows a little bit more. There. But again, I've switched from a color image with 3 channels, red, green, and blue, to a black and white image with one channel, a luminance channel or brightness channel, that's it, just tonal values, shades of gray, I need to revisit my basic adjustments. I might want to go and push clarity a little further, for example. Now that it's all about the texture because we've taken out the color, maybe I want to emphasize it. Or maybe it's overemphasized. I need to tone things down just a little bit. But, as you'll see with this image, if we pretend like we wanted to convert this one to black and white, I'll switch to my B&W option here. And remember, there were some blues in this photo. Well, we can darken or brighten just the blues. Or darken or brighten just the reds or the oranges. There were some greens in there. Maybe we brighten those up, and the aquas, etc. So now we're seeing a more significant effect because we have a lot more color going on in this photo. And so I'd want to play with those individual values, brighten the different colors, etc. Maybe even this is one of those situations where I would tend to use my on-image adjustment. Here it would be a little challenging because there's lots of small areas of color, but this little target icon up in the top left corner of my black and white mix controls, if I click on that option and go over let's get this onto the image in a way. Well, in fact, let's switch to a different image so that you'll be able to see that a little bit better. So if I click that on image adjustment option and come out over the image, you see that I have this little funny icon with the circle and the arrows. Well, I can point to the image and click and drag up or down to darken that color. So if I don't remember what color something was, what color was the sky? I have no idea, I can't recall. So I just point to the sky, click, and drag downward on the sky to darken or upward to brighten. So maybe I want to darken, and the airplane needs to be brightened up a little bit. So if we point at the airplane, click and drag upward, we can brighten up the airplane. Let's go down here, I forget what color the wheat field was, click and drag downward to darken. So I can work directly on the image just by pointing, click, drag up or down to lighten or darken. Now obviously that's, at the moment, luminance values, brightness values. We have the same basic controls available. So here's hue, for example. I can click on that little target, come out into the image, and now I'm shifting the hue for that color. For me personally, I find that I don't use this option, this on-image adjustment, very much when it's a color image. I'm usually only using it for black and white image. It's just how I tend to, partly because when it's black and white, I can't remember half the time what some of the colors really were. So it'll vary a little bit, but when I hover over, you'll notice that the numeric value for my slider, so right now you see that the yellow value is lit up. It's got a kind of a rectangle, a gray rectangle around it. So that's telling me what color I'm over at any given moment, so I know what I'm hovering over. But again, I can just click and drag to alter that color in the photo. So pretty handy. And look how much better the color looks now. Not really. All right. So, and oftentimes, we talked about our motivation for the photo. What are we trying to convey? What's the mood? What's our story? However it is that you think about the image, this is one that really required a lot of work to get where I was planning to go with it. I had an amazing experience when I captured this image. Some of you have heard the story before, but I was in Japan, and an elderly Japanese woman called me over, waved me over, and I thought I was in big trouble. And instead, without any language, because I don't speak Japanese, she spoke only one word of English. With basically no language at all, she taught me how to pray at the Buddhist temple. Amazing experience. Had this picture I thought was going to be so good. Then I wasn't very happy with it. And so I was trying to think about, how do I make the photo reflect the experience? I thought, well, it needs to be a little bit more dramatic, and it needs to feel a little more timeless. And so, it's a little bit cliche, you might say, but I went into black and white. Obviously, I could fine-tune these controls. They're not going to have a huge, significant effect because, as you saw, the image itself is relatively monochromatic. I might boost my overall contrast, set the white point, for example. And I probably don't need a pure white in this case, so back that off just a little bit. So again, just revisiting all the same things, but it's not robotic, it's not mechanical. It's about, how do I interpret this specific photo? And I think it's one of the important things to keep in mind when we're working on our images, is that it's not this rote process where you do the same things to every single image. It's, what does this image need? And so getting a little more contrast, a little more drama, we'll take that clarity up a little bit. Well, let's let's visit some controls we haven't taken a look at yet. Split toning. I want to add a little bit of a color tone to this image. maybe kind of a sepia, not to be cliche about it, but a little bit of a sepia tone. So highlights and shadows, I can shift the hue and you'll see that I have absolutely no effect on the image whatsoever because saturation is set to 0. I've got to give it something. And what I usually do is crank it up a lot. Increase the saturation significantly. And I can do that for both the highlights and the shadows and then choose which color I want for the highlights and the shadows. Kodachrome gone bad. I can also shift the balance. Ah, those are perfect colors, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, sure.
The microphone might not have picked that up, but everybody was hollering in agreement about how those colors, no. They're perfect, but I need to shift them so that it's more of the red, less of the green. Well, that's where our balance comes into play. I can say, give me more of the shadow color or more of the highlight color. In fact, I think in this case, give me only the highlight color. In other words, I want one color, not two. And maybe some might suggest that this is not the right color to use, so maybe we shift the value for hue downward a little bit, and maybe somewhere around there-ish, kind of a sepia tone type of a color. Now that saturation was overdone, which I sort of mentioned at the beginning. I crank it up so that I can better evaluate which color I'm actually getting, and then, because subtlety is my middle name, I would take that value down rather significantly, so maybe right about there. And in many cases, I'm taking that color down to the point, the saturation level down to the point where I think, oh, oops, I got rid of all that color that I just added. Then I'll flip this little switch, so you've noticed that many of the controls have a little light switch to the left of the header. If I click that, it turns off that entire section of controls, so in this case, the split toning. And I say, oh, wow, okay, I thought I had taken the saturation down a little bit too low, but now that I turn it off and on, I can see, actually, it's still probably a little bit too high, and I'd like to shift it to a little bit more of a yellowish tone. I don't want it to get into the green there, but a little bit more yellow than it was, and I'll reduce that saturation even more. So somewhere in that general vicinity, let's say. So far, so good. Let's take a look at another control that we've not yet talked about and that many people like to abuse. And that would be our vignette. Not just vignetting, but post-crop vignetting. Meaning if I go crop this image later, whatever shape I had for the vignette will follow the crop. So I'm not cropping the vignette out of the photo. Just by way of illustration, if I go into the crop and let's just make the image look like that, now the crop is just that portion, or the vignette rather is just that portion, the crop portion. So the vignette follows the crop. I'll just go ahead and reset that, which is helpful in case you decide to fine-tune your crop later. But again, that's a little bit of a strong adjustment. I actually do want, in this case, a relatively strong adjustment, but not that strong. I'll leave it exaggerated for the moment just so we can better see what our other controls do here. So midpoint, do I want the vignette to come way into the middle of the image or to stay way out toward the edges? Do I want it to be more roundish or rectangular, including getting this sort of faded edge kind of effect, which can be pretty cool actually? And how much feathering do I want? Do I want none? Let's bring this in a little bit. Do I want no feathering at all? Or do I want to blend it? And usually I want a fair amount of feathering. So, in this case, semi-strong. I essentially want an obvious vignette in the photo. So this is an image that I would take very, very strong effect with vignette, whereas normally it's very, very subtle. You almost don't notice it until you turn it off, kind of a thing. So it varies depending on the image. Highlights, by the way, this image does not reflect the highlights control. Let me see if I don't think I really have one that does. But with highlights, if you photograph a scene and the sun is in the frame and you apply a vignette, well, if we're trying to mimic lens vignetting, that sun is way powerful and it's going to overpower the vignetting that the lens would otherwise cause. With highlights, we can essentially mimic that effect. We can let those bright areas shine through the vignette. So we can brighten up the very brightest areas to make it look a little bit more realistic. Because after all, if the sun's in your frame, it's probably not going to be vignetted in that area of the photo. All right. Noise reduction. Oh, actually, it looks like this image doesn't even need noise reduction. Looks pretty good. Probably, that advertisement about the camera being able to shoot up to 10 million ISO was right. What was this one at? 16,000 ISO. 16,000 ISO and no color noise at all. We should run out and buy that camera right now, shouldn't we? Or we should say, hey, Lightroom, please stop lying to us, because Lightroom is applying some noise reduction, color noise reduction by default. So let's turn off our detail section here and see what the image really looks like. I don't know how easily, let's zoom into 4:1 here. Dare we brighten up the exposure? Oh, look at that wonderful noise. But Lightroom is trying to convince us that our camera is better than it is by applying a little bit of color noise reduction right from the start. Now, obviously, that's a good thing, right? It just means we don't necessarily understand the true behavior of our camera right off the bat. So what I like to do is to bring that color value for noise reduction down and then start to increase it again. So start from nothing and bring it on up. Because remember, noise reduction is a compromise. When we're reducing noise, we're reducing possibly saturation, we're shifting color values around in the photo, we're essentially averaging colors in the photo, and that can be problematic if we take it too far. It's worse when it comes to luminance, which we'll see in a moment. So I'll increase the color noise value just as much as I actually need. Let's go ahead and zoom in over here, and we'll find that we've reduced color noise to the point that there are no more pixels of noise, but there are now blobs of noise. If you take a look along the shadow line here, see there's little blobs of magenta and green. Smoothness can help us with that. So I'll increase the value for smoothness, and you'll see that that starts to fade away, blend in a little bit more. And I still need a little bit stronger effect for that color value. And I would say probably right about there will do the trick. So I want as much as I need, but no more. With color, it's not too difficult to get a good result, and there's not much risk in terms of causing problems in the photo. When it comes to luminance noise, what you might call sort of a film grain type of effect, variations in terms of tonality. There. See how easy it is to get rid of all the luminance noise in your photo? There is not a single bit of luminance noise in this photo anymore. It is amazing. There is also not a single bit of texture or detail in this photo anymore. See how easy that was as well. So luminance noise reduction is especially risky. And quite frankly, I would say that applying luminance noise reduction must be done at a very, very modest level. Don't try to get rid of the noise, just try and tone it down. Quite frankly, the effect you're going to achieve if you go just a little bit too far is that the image starts to look soft. You can compensate for that a little by enhancing clarity, contrast, by sharpening a little bit, but by and large, it's going to be problematic because, again, noise reduction is a compromise. So very often I will do everything I can to get rid of the color noise. Luminance noise I'll generally just leave alone, maybe increase just a little bit to tone down some of that texture, that grain effect. All right, and then sharpening. Zoom back out on this one. So sharpening, what is sharpening? Sharpening is taking an out-of-focus picture and magically making it tack sharp and perfectly focused, right? That is going to be a really good day when they invent that one, right? But no, so in the background here, you can see, what was the aperture here? Probably f4, I'm guessing. No, f8 even. But I was focusing so close. Even though I stopped down to f8, I was focusing very close on the brooms because, I mean, come on. If you saw brooms at a market, wouldn't you need to photograph them also? It's like the cabbage. I don't know why I did it, I just did. So I cannot take this area in the background that is clearly out of focus and make it look in focus. I'm not, hopefully, trying to compensate for out of focus. I'm trying to compensate for the various factors that cause less than ideal sharpness, like a lens that wasn't quite as expensive as it should have been and therefore isn't quite as sharp as I'd like, or the infrared cutoff filter, or the anti-aliasing filter on your image sensor, on most image sensors, although not all. So there are various filters, there are various processes that'll reduce overall sharpness. So let's zoom in first to 1:1 and take a look at an area of the photo that we want to make sure is sharp, and then we can consider the sharpening settings. So these are reasonably straightforward, but it's easier if you see a visual example. So the amount, that's just the strength. How much sharpness do we want to add? Really think of it as contrast, but on a very small scale. Speaking of scale, size. How big an area do we want that contrast enhancement to affect? So when we're sharpening an image, we're taking areas that already have contrast and giving them more contrast. So what would be the most contrast you can have between 2 pixels? 1 pixel is black, the next pixel is absolutely pure white. Boy, that's sharp. That's a crisp edge. What does softness look like in that context? Well, instead of going from black to white for neighboring pixels, maybe there's 10 pixels in between that are different shades of gray, so there's a blending, a transition. So sharpening is taking that contrast that's not super contrasty and enhancing it, basically making it more contrasty, but at a very small scale. Radius determines that scale. Detail. Do we want every single possible tonal value difference within the image to be enhanced, or just the strong ones? To take the things that are pretty close to being sharp and making them sharper, for example. And then masking. Similar in concept, but do we want just the edges of objects or the entire surface of the object? Let's see a visual example of that, just because I think it's a little bit easier. So starting off with amount. If we hold that magical Alt or Option key on the keyboard, then we get a preview, a grayscale preview of the effect. So as we increase the value, it's happening at a very small scale, so it's not the easiest thing to see. You got to look closely, but you see how that contrast gets a little stronger. The edge gets a little bit more enhanced. I'll leave that kind of at a very high value for the moment, and we'll go to radius. And now we get this emboss look. So we can see there's a small radius, so we've got these fine little transitions versus these bigger, stronger transitions occurring over a larger distance. Detail. Every little nook and cranny, or just the more significant edges? And then, let me zoom out for this one. Do we literally want just the edges of the texture? So, you see we're kind of going for, in fact, let's go to this image real quick so that you can see that effect a little bit more clearly. Do we literally want, just the edges of the bird, the edge of the beak without the center of the beak, the edge of the head without the head itself, no sky, etc., or do we want the entire image to be affected? Generally speaking, this sharpening is what's often referred to as input sharpening or capture sharpening. We only want to compensate for the way the image came out of the camera. This isn't getting it ready for print. This isn't even getting it ready for display on a website. And so we're going to be relatively modest in terms of the effect we apply. Generally speaking, radius somewhere around 1 is going to work pretty well. Think of higher detail image, smaller radius. Lower detailed image, larger radius. So generally somewhere around 1 for an image where there's a lot of detail, maybe up to as high as about 2 for an image that has smoother textures on it. Amount, generally speaking, somewhere in the, at the low end, maybe 50, but somewhere 75 to 100, give or take, again, depending on the image. And then detail and masking will just depend on your preference. Do you really want to emphasize every little nook and cranny in the photo? It's, sand, or it's, some rock texture, and you really want to enhance it, then you might increase the value for detail. Is it a picture of a person, especially a woman? They don't want lots of texture on their face. We want to leave that down, and we'll sharpen a little bit less. All right, so do we want every little nook and cranny to be enhanced or not? Whereas, with a woman, generally you don't want to enhance every nook and cranny, whereas a man, you might. We want that kind of gritty look sometimes, that kind of industrial portrait, what have you. But think about how much detail you want. And then in some cases, I'll even use that masking value where I'm really worried about taking smooth textures and making them a little bit mottled, having a little bit of like film grain kind of a look to them. So if I want to preserve a smooth sky, I'll probably want to keep that masking, the detail rather, at a low value, and I might increase the value for masking so that the smooth areas are going to be left alone altogether. All right, here's one I never need. Spot removal. Now, if I had an image that was difficult in terms of some sort of cleanup task, there's a lot of texture that I need to preserve, etc., then I will send the image over to Photoshop. Lightroom does a good job in terms of basic spotting, but when it comes to real significant image cleanup, absolutely better off sending the photo over to Photoshop, take advantage of the content-aware capabilities and the more sophisticated tools that are there. In this case, I have, let's see, we can count 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 spots in the sky, each painstakingly painted by hand so that I would have an image to illustrate What happens if you let your image sensor get dirty, which of course I didn't. 4 of them? 5 maybe? 4? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, I think it's only 4. I would never let more than 4 spots get on my image sensor. So I'm going to go to the spot removal tool, this little arrow on a circle icon on a little mini toolbar below the histogram. And just to make sure, I mean, I'm sure there's only 4 spots, but just to be safe, I'm going to go ahead and turn on the visualize spots checkbox, and then I'll move that slider around. And there's another one up here, and there's another one here, and there's another one over there. And boy, we should turn this off really fast before you actually count how many spots were in that photo. So that visualize spots can be really, really helpful for identifying. So these ones up here, if you kind of pay attention to this area, if you can see, up toward the top right of the photo, then when I turn off visualize spots, you say, oh yeah, if I look closely, I can see those spots. I didn't even notice them before. So even when you think the image is clean, not a bad idea to use visualize spots to help evaluate the photo. And do be sure to move that slider. Usually I find in most cases, taking it all the way to the far right works best, but you will find that in some cases, some of those spots are easier to see in between. Like here, for example, some of them are even easier to see because now we've got a little more contrast. We have more of a black sky where we can see those little white rings more easily. Clearly indicating that it's not dust, it was water droplets that I painstakingly painted onto my image sensor. Note to self, when you're changing lenses in humid Florida, you're going to get moisture and it's going to create problems. Now when I'm in this visualize spots view, I can actually work with my spot removal. I want to work in heal almost exclusively because I want some blending so that it matches, the source and destination match each other well. And the size doesn't matter because we'll adjust it. Feathering I generally leave at 0 because I want a nice crisp brush. There's going to be blending anyway because I'm using the heal option, so I don't need a soft brush as well, and just makes it, in my mind, a little easier to paint. And I love that this even exists, although there are situations where you would use it. But opacity, we can reduce the opacity of our cleanup. I don't want to completely remove my dust spots. I just want to tone them down a little bit. But obviously there would be other blemishes where you might actually truly want to tone them down. Generally speaking though, you'll want that opacity at 100%. I can come out over the image. Left and right square bracket keys allow me to adjust the size of the brush, so I don't even need to worry about the size slider. Just while I'm working, while I'm working, left square bracket on the keyboard to reduce the size, right square bracket to increase the size, and generally speaking, I want a brush size that is the size of the dust spot, tiny bit larger. And then I can just click or click and drag a little bit. I can even paint an arc if I needed that sort of shape. I'll show you that in a moment. So just click on that dust spot, click on that one. Notice that the source is being set for me automatically. I'll go ahead and turn off visualize spots. We can see those spots magically disappearing, but I can choose the source. So I can click on one of my spot removals, and here's the destination. In other words, the area being cleaned up. Here's the source. And I can say, no, I want to put a bird's eye in the sky or something. But if the source wasn't chosen in a good way, I can change that source. So if for some reason Lightroom said, oh yes, let's put the bird's eye in the sky, we could say, no, very funny Lightroom, but we want sky to be taking the place of the sky. Also notice a lot of photographers miss this. There's a tool overlay option down on the toolbar. I have mine set to auto. By default, it's set to always so that you always see those spots on the image. I'm trying to get rid of spots and it keeps showing me all these other spots on the image, and it makes it, in my mind, a little bit more difficult to evaluate your work. Did I do a good job? And so I like auto because then when I'm over the image, when my mouse is over the image, I see the spots. What have I cleaned up? And whichever one I've clicked on becomes my source, shows me the source rather. So I can move it around. I can even resize by dragging the edge if need be. And then, because I have that tool overlay option set to auto, if I move my mouse off the image, away from the image, those spots all disappear. So I can say, oh, did I get them all? Did I do a good job, etc. Here's my favorite feature, I think, in all of Lightroom. You ready? So let's say I paint, this shape needs to be cleaned up. Then the source and the destination, of course, are going to match each other. So I can paint whatever shape I need. If there was some piece of thread stuck on my sensor or what have you, I could trace along that. But in this case, I was just illustrating a point. I don't actually want this spot. Well, if I click on the spot removal area, notice I have a little button in the center, and I can even move it around, etc. But, you ready for it? Watch. When I press the delete key to get rid of it, Isn't that cool? I want to do it again. So any shape I want, delete, disappears in a puff of smoke. Amazing. Yes, really is my favorite feature in all of Lightroom. I mean, that and clarity and vibrance. All right. So here's an image, 3 of them. This is in Rome, of course. 3 countries, 1 frame. Well, 3 countries, 3 frames, as it turns out, because this was for an HDR, because you can see that with an exposure that gives me the basilica with good detail, the foreground is super, super dark. And if I get a little bit of detail in the shrubs in the foreground, then the basilica, maybe not completely, but darn near disappears. So capture multiple exposures, bracketed. This happens to be shot through a keyhole. Anybody been to this spot? Next time you go to Rome, let me know. I'll tell you how to find it. Or just Google Order of Malta in Rome. But you look through this keyhole and you see the basilica. It's pretty great. So of course we want to capture a photo to commemorate the experience. But the tonal range is just too extreme, so I need to capture multiple images and blend them into an HDR, a high dynamic range image, which I can then tone map in the develop module in Lightroom. And in fact, now I can actually assemble inside of Lightroom. In theory, I could apply some adjustments. Let's go ahead, for example, I just want to show you the capability, and I'll use the brighter exposure here so you can see a little bit better. Just the fact that we can adjust multiple exposures. So since I have multiple images, I might want to apply the same adjustments to each of them. And so, for example, maybe I wanted to convert to black and white, but you'll notice, you might not be able to tell from the thumbnails, but only the currently active image is being adjusted, even though I've selected multiple. But I can then synchronize, so I can click the sync button, pick and choose which adjustments I want to synchronize across all of the currently selected images, and click synchronize. Now all 3 of those thumbnails, you might be able to see, have been shifted to black and white. But I can also turn on that sync switch. So hypothetically speaking, if I wanted to increase the exposure, when I release, you'll see all of them adjust, or decrease the exposure, and you see all 3 of those thumbnails adjust. Maybe I want a little bit of clarity, etc. So I can apply adjustments to multiple images. With an HDR, obviously not especially necessary because I can do the tone mapping after the fact, but maybe I wanted, black and white interpretation. All right, so then once I've got everything set in terms of those, really I was just showing off that you can synchronize adjustments across multiple images. But then I can go to the photo menu. Once again, I've selected all of the frames from my HDR, all of the, in this case, 3 exposures. I think these were separated by 2 stops each. Blend them all together by going to the photo menu after I've selected the images. Photo, photo merge, HDR. Lightroom will render a preview. Takes a few minutes to render that preview. Well, not a few minutes literally, but a few seconds to render that preview, depending on the resolution, obviously. But while we're waiting for that, notice we've got an auto align checkbox. Do we want the images aligned? Yes. Even if you're on a tripod? Yes. Maybe there was some subtle difference. Maybe somebody kicked your tripod. I don't know. In this case, the shot was handheld because there's a line of people, literally a line of people waiting to look through this keyhole. So if I'm setting up a tripod, you can imagine the sort of response I would get. So handheld, I didn't move, not 1 pixel, but just to be on the safe side in case there was an ever so slight shift in my position as I was squatting at the, looking through the keyhole. I want that auto align turned on. Auto tone. Yes, remember, Lightroom is non-destructive. So when I go and apply adjustments, I can always change them. I can always reset them. I might as well, especially with an HDR, let's start with something close to reasonably accurate. So I want the auto tone checkbox turned on. Basically means auto adjust this image to try to make it look pretty good based on Lightroom's evaluation of the values in the photo. And then the deghosting. If anything moved. Now obviously we know that I was holding that camera perfectly still, but I turned on the alignment option just in case. But what if something in the frame moved from one frame to the next? So the bush in the breeze maybe is wiggling around just a little bit. Lightroom, when it's assembling that HDR, it recognizes where pixels moved in the image, and it can pick one where it's not moving. So in other words, it's going to use one frame, or it's going to focus on one frame, have that area be more dominant from one of those frames so that something that's moving is hopefully not ghosted at all. We can choose none, low, medium, or high. Notice that we have a deghost overlay checkbox. We can choose to show the deghost overlay. If there were any areas that it thought needed ghost reduction, then they would have a little reddish overlay on top of them and a translucent overlay on top of those areas. Looks like we're pretty good here. So we'll go ahead and merge those images. This light leak that appears to be happening for the image, that's not a light leak. There was nothing wrong with my lens. I didn't, open up the film canister while I was developing. Okay, it was digital. That's actually the frame of the keyhole, because the keyhole's not big enough for my 24-105 lens, so I get a little bit of light reflecting off. It's basically out of focus metal, the edge of that keyhole that we're seeing there. And here is my HDR image. So you can see I've got detail in the background. See, now I realize that was a bad example that I was using before. I was trying to show off and show you that you could apply the same adjustment to multiple images all at the same time. But now I made the image black and white and I didn't even want to. That's so embarrassing. And this is being recorded, so you're all going to be able to watch this on YouTube later and laugh at me in my moment of embarrassment. So we'll edit that out of the video. Not really. I can take it. But now I need to go back and revert the adjustment on all three of my exposures and synchronize them and then rebuild the HDR all over again, but we don't have time for that. Thank goodness. Oh yeah, let it sink in. Oh, remember when I said Lightroom was non-destructive? Even when you take individual captures, raw captures, and blend them together into an HDR image, the adjustments are still metadata. You're not baking in those adjustments to your HDR. Is that amazing or what? So whatever you've synchronized across those images in this case, it's not baked in, it's not locked in. You can still go back and make changes if you'd like. You'll notice these really significant adjustments to the basic controls. That's my auto tone. That's my Hey Lightroom. Try to make it look reasonably close to what we think we'll want. Let's see how it did. Oh, that's pretty spot on in terms of the whites. The blacks, I'll probably pull down just a little bit more. Highlights, notice it brought the highlights all the way down. And if we zoom in, I think you'll be able to tell even, it's a little artificial looking. It's a little bit too much, and this is one of the common problems with HDR, is that there's too much detail and it starts to look a little bit muddy. So I would generally increase the value for highlights a little bit just to make that basilica fade into the haze, which is what it really did look like. I want it visible, I want you to know it's the basilica, but I don't want it to look quite so artificial. So maybe somewhere around there. I might even darken down some of those shadows because I do like the contrast in the image. So somewhere around there, we can continue fine tuning. What do we do about that edge of the keyhole where we're able to see a little bit of that flare? We do two things. Number one, we crop. So I'm going to switch to the crop tool and we'll crop it out mostly. Now I am also very, very detail oriented, and so I want to make sure that that basilica lines up with the absolute center of my crop box. The problem is the crop box has only got this rule of thirds display, so as I'm moving the image around, I'm literally just dragging the image within the crop, and that's difficult. Fortunately, Lightroom has a solution for that as well. So if we go up onto the Tools menu, you'll see that we have a crop guide overlay, and we can choose from a variety of shapes for that crop guide. So I don't have to just see the rule of thirds markers. I can actually go to a grid in this case. Wow, I actually did pretty good there. That's a surprise. So I can go to a grid display, so I actually have a center line, and I can make sure to get that center line lined up with the basilica, and maybe I'll crop down a little bit. I don't have to maintain the aspect ratio. You see the lock icon over here to the right-hand side? Notice that it's a closed lock. If I click on it, it'll open up, and then I can change the aspect ratio if I want. So I can adjust the height of the crop, for example, without adjusting the width. So maybe something along those lines, give or take. I'll click Done to finalize the crop. oh, it's still not quite completely cropped out of the image, but I don't want to crop any further, so now what am I going to do? We already saw the solution earlier. We will apply a post-crop vignette to the image. So now that we've cropped, we'll darken down the edges. Oh, something like that I think will work pretty well. Pretty cool. So let's take a look, just kind of a high-level overview of a couple of images here. If we take a look at the basic set of controls here, holding the Alt-Option key, and taking the whites, there we go, right there, all the way up till we're just about clipping, but not quite, and maybe about there. And let's darken the shadows for more drama, and darken the highlights. And now we have this over-processed, really dark, weird-looking image because we just went through this like mechanical process of, oh, we need to get it right to the point of clipping and then back it off. Do we need that here? No. Sure, that area above the door, it's kind of almost white. Yeah, but I don't want it to be white. There's nothing that's reflecting bright light here. I don't need a bright white point in the image. Black point I probably do want to have pretty dark. I certainly don't want to darken up the shadows much, if at all. I might even open them up just a tiny little bit. And then the highlights, actually I probably would brighten the highlights in this case, just to give me a little bit more contrast in some of those areas. Clarity, I might even use a slight negative value. Most of the time I want to enhance texture and detail. But for this image, I might want it to be a little bit more painterly, a little more delicate looking. And so I might actually use a negative value for clarity to kind of soften up the overall image. Not meaning make it not sharp, but to soften up the impact, the overall contrast and textures. The color's important here. I might want to bring up some of those oranges a little bit just to kind of even them out with the greens. But I don't really want too much in the way of saturation. I might want to even out the colors, but I'll use certainly a little bit of a negative value for that saturation slider here as well. Again, a little bit more muted effect. So it's not this just robotic, automatic approach to adjusting the image. It's what's the feel of this image, or what do I want the feel of this image to be? And your answer might be different from mine. You might think that everything I just did with this image was totally wrong aesthetically. And that's okay too, except it's my picture, so I get to decide. But when it's your picture, you get to decide, what are you trying to convey? What is the mood that you want this image to give you? Another quick example here. Here I do actually want to have a fair bit of contrast. So let's take a look at what the whites might look like if I increase that value. I mean, it's snow, right? So it should certainly be white. Actually, that I can get away with. And what about the black point? Well, let's bring that down, because there are those exposed rock areas. So I actually might want those extremes in this case, but I definitely want to darken up the highlights a little, not so much because I want the highlights to be darker, but because I want to enhance that little texture, that play of light across the snow, especially on the right sides of the peaks here. I might want to enhance a little bit. But the shadows I might actually open up, mostly because I don't want these areas of exposed rock to look kind of inky black. I just want them to, have a little bit of a darker value. I want them to stand out as, being those dark spots that they are. But I might open up that shadow detail just a little bit. Clarity. I don't want to go too far, because part of what I liked about this scene was that these mountains just seem to sort of blend off into the overcast sky. And if I take that clarity too far, that starts to separate. The mountains from the sky tend to separate a little bit. But I love that shadow, that kind of dappled light, because of the nooks and crannies of the snow. I love that. I do want to enhance it just a little bit. And so notice that as I increase that clarity, I'm essentially just darkening down what would be essentially the shadows, as it were, on the sides of the mountain. So a little bit more of a delicate adjustment. What about saturation? Well, if I bring up the color, there are colors there, but I sure don't want them. Do I want to neutralize to black and white? No. I want very subtle color in the image. And so frankly, in this case, I probably just leave those adjustments alone, leave them at their neutral values. I might take a look at the overall color temperature, and if anything, I would err on the side of being ever so slightly blue in this case. There's a hint of magenta I'm seeing there, so just offset that just slightly. There's very different goals for different images in terms of contrast, in terms of texture, in terms of overall tonality, etc. But again, all of it comes from, yes, number one, understanding what these various controls do in Lightroom, but more importantly, getting to the point where you understand what those tools are and how to accomplish a goal so that you can then look at the image and think, okay, for this photo, why did I take it? What about this subject, about this scene, captured my attention, caused me to push that button in the first place to take the picture, and how do I enhance that? How do I bring out the stuff I like? How do I tone down the stuff I don't like? And how do I fine tune? And when I think I'm finished, then I go away. But then I come back and check it again. All right, what was I doing? Let's do that backslash trick. Before, after, before, after. Well, a little bit too much color. I want to tone that down a little bit now that I'm taking a closer look. And so revisiting the image and fine-tuning whatever it is that needs to be fine-tuned. Go through, scroll through the various adjustments. What did I miss? What sorts of things did I not do that I might want to do for this image? Oh yes, a vignette. Maybe in this case, a brightening vignette. Not literally, because I usually don't do that, but maybe I want to brighten the edges so that it fades off of the page even more. So again, just evaluating the image and evaluating the reason that that scene caught your attention in the first place, and figure out what sorts of things do I need to do to that image in order to make it an image that I'm really happy with, and then revisit and make it even better. Thank you guys very, very much.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.